All right, let's dive into a really fierce debate, one where doing something that's totally legal in your state could actually cost you a constitutional right. Yeah, we're talking about the huge legal clash between marijuana use and the Second Amendment.
So here's the central paradox, right? In a whole bunch of states, you can walk into a store and legally buy cannabis. But if you do that, federal law steps in and says, nope, you can't legally buy a gun. So how can something be legal enough for your state, but at the same time illegal enough to strip you of a constitutional right? That's the massive question at the heart of this whole thing.
So, how in the world did we get here? Well, it all boils down to this direct collision between what the federal government says and what state laws say, with your individual rights just caught right in the crossfire.
Okay, this right here is the key piece of the puzzle. Federal Law 922G3 is what actually blocks gun ownership. And the really crucial part is that phrase, unlawful user of any controlled substance. That one little phrase is what causes the entire problem.
And here's that disconnect in plain sight. You've got dozens of states that have said marijuana is permitted, but the federal government, they haven't budged on their classification. So, under federal law, even a medical marijuana patient in a state where it's perfectly legal is still considered an unlawful user. And that, you can imagine, has massive consequences for their Second Amendment rights.
Now, as you can probably guess, this conflict has ignited a really powerful response from constitutional liberty advocates. They're not just saying this is an inconsistency, they're arguing that this is a direct attack on a fundamental American right. This quote really frames the debate around what advocates call a glaring double standard. They ask a pretty simple question. If alcohol, which we all know can impair judgment, doesn't disqualify you from owning a gun, then why should cannabis? To them, it's just pure hypocrisy, bakes right into the law. And Senator Dan Sullivan really gets to the constitutional heart of it here. The belief is that the Second Amendment is a foundational right. So a federal statute, which is really just a law passed by Congress, shouldn't be able to just override it, especially not based on an activity that's legal in so many places. People on this side of the argument also point to the real world for proof. They say, look at states like Alaska and Colorado. Both have a ton of gun owners, and legal cannabis is common. And they argue there hasn't been some big crisis of violence. They see this as evidence that the federal government's fears are, maybe a little overblown. But of course, there's a really compelling counterargument. And this one is rooted in what many see as the government's #1 job, ensuring public safety. From a public safety perspective, the logic is pretty straightforward. Any substance that can mess with your judgment becomes a potential danger when you mix it with a deadly weapon. They'd argue the goal of the federal law isn't to punish cannabis users, but to prevent potential tragedies by just drawing a very clear line. So what we have here are two completely different ways of looking at risk. On one side, the big fear is that a constitutional right is being unfairly chipped away. On the other side, the fear is that if you loosen this rule, it could lead to more violence. The whole debate really just boils down to which risk you think is worse. And just to add another layer of complexity to all of this, there's the substance itself. Public safety analysts are arguing that the marijuana today is a totally different beast from what people were using decades ago, and that raises a whole new set of questions.
The concerns really focus on three main points. First, today's cannabis is often engineered to be way, way more potent than in the past. Second, there are these growing alarms about potential links between these super potent strains and psychosis. And third, we just don't have a lot of long-term research. All that uncertainty really fuels the argument for playing it safe.
With such a deep disagreement, it is absolutely no surprise that this fight has moved out of the state houses and into the courthouses. This is where those abstract ideas of liberty and safety are actually being put to the test against real legal standards.
And what's happening now is the courts are pushing back hard against the federal ban. Following some recent Supreme Court decisions, judges are demanding historical proof, not just modern-day fears. They're basically asking the government, show us where, in our nation's history, we've ever taken guns away from people just for using intoxicants. And in places like Texas, the courts have said the government couldn't provide that proof, leading them to rule the ban unconstitutional. This is a huge legal shift.
And look, this isn't just some theoretical legal debate. The current law has serious, real-world consequences. Lying about your drug use on the federal form you have to fill out to buy a gun, that's a felony. The very high-profile case involving Hunter Biden really brought this issue to the national stage, showing everyone that the government is willing to enforce this law. even while its very constitutionality is being challenged. So all of this leaves us in a really messy, uncertain present. What does the path forward even look like when you have state laws, federal laws, and court rulings all pointing in completely different directions? I mean, this table just lays out the confusing reality for any normal person. Look at that stark difference. Alcohol use, legal on both the state and federal level, with zero impact on your gun rights. But for marijuana, you've got this contradictory mess, where doing something your state says is fine can get your constitutional right taken away at the federal level. Because of all this confusion, we're starting to see a push for change from lawmakers themselves. In states like Kentucky and Pennsylvania, there's growing pressure to pass new laws to protect the Second Amendment rights of their citizens, especially medical marijuana patients, who feel like they're being forced to choose between their medicine and their right to self-defense. Ultimately, though, this question might just be too big for Congress or the lower courts to solve on their own. All signs seem to be pointing toward a potential showdown at the Supreme Court. And a definitive ruling from them could do way more than just settle this one gun issue. It could fundamentally reshape America's drug policy and how we interpret the Second Amendment for generations to come. Which leaves us with this final, critical question. This whole debate is framed as a choice between individual liberty and collective safety, but is that a false choice? Is there a way to find a path that respects constitutional rights while still taking public safety seriously? The answer to that remains one of the most pressing legal challenges of our time.